Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Brookings and to what I think will be a fascinating discussion on faith, feminism, and the family, the three Fs, so it's easy to remember. I'm Belle Sawhill, and I am a senior fellow here, but I am really representing the Center on Children and Families this morning. My colleague, Richard Reeves, who was involved in this report as a co-author, I can't remember now whether he's in Las Vegas or London or Paris. I only know he was scheduled to be in all three places in a single week. And so my hat is off to him. He does a lot, but he's very interested in these issues as well, as is the other co-director of the Center on Family and Children, Ron Haskins. So my own interest goes back a long way. My very first book was on the family, and I wrote another one a couple of years ago called Generation Unbound, Drifting into Sex and Parenthood Without Marriage. And so I continue to follow the work of the group that's with us today. I want to say, in the interest of full transparency, that I consider myself a feminist, that I consider myself someone who believes that families, especially married, stable families, have good effects on children. Written a lot about that. And on the faith front, I really believe faith is an important element in many people's lives, although it's not a big element in my own life. I was interested in looking at the data in the report that one of the most common categorizations when you ask people what their religion is was SBNR. And when I first looked at that, I thought, what the hell? I shouldn't use what the hell in this group, right? But what in the world is SBNR? And it's spiritual but no religion. And so that's interesting. Now, the credit for organizing this event goes entirely to my friend Brad Wilcox. He's a towering figure in this field, and I have huge respect for him, even though he and I don't always agree on everything. And I want to thank him and his various collaborators who you're going to be hearing from, including the Family Studies Institute, or Institute for Family Studies, and the Wheatley Institution, and various other partners that they had in their work. As you know, or you will learn, this has been a multi-country study, so the data that they used are very extensive and interesting. So with that, let me invite the first panel to come up here to the stage. The first panel is going to be, come on up, guys, going to be Lori DeRose. She's in the Department of Sociology at Georgetown. Also, Spencer James, Associate Professor, Department of Family Life, Brigham Young University. And Conrad Hackett, Associate Director of Research, Pew Research Center. And last but not least, Christine Emba, who's a columnist with the Washington Post. So turn it all over to you now. Thanks.
There we go. So the report that I've seen copies of, I hadn't seen hard copy until this morning, that you have is The Ties That Bind, and there are three main chapters. So I'm first going to tell you about the first one, which is faith and fertility in the 21st century. Then Spencer will talk more about relationship quality, and then I'll talk about negative aspects of relationship quality, namely domestic violence and infidelity. But let's start with fertility. Okay, so basically the question in our first chapter is religion still pronatalist? And to some people it might be like, yeah, of course it is. But it's actually an important question when the highly religious United States has reached an all-time low in terms of its total fertility rate. CDC just produced those statistics this week, and that's one of the things that was supposed to be keeping our fertility higher than other developed countries, was that we were a more religious country. And in general, women in more developed countries average 1.6 children. But there's a pronounced fertility fork with countries clustering around 1.9 and around 1.3. It looks like this. If you look back in the 1980s, there's a bunch of countries at all sorts of different levels. But as you go forward in time, there aren't that many in the middle anymore. And the question is, what's different about the countries that have a higher, more sustainable fertility and those countries that are clustering around a lowest low fertility? And what Rinfus, the author who published the piece that I just showed you the graphic from, says that it is generally easier to combine work and motherhood in the countries at the high end of the fertility fork. And they emphasize very much that there's more than one way to do that. Fathers are more involved in the United States than in some other countries. Policy is better in some other countries than the United States. There's more than one way to do it, but essentially that's sort of the key to higher fertility is a compatibility between work and motherhood. And this fits with the rhetoric that says that gender equity is the new natalism, that if you provide for women to be workers and if men are more involved in the family, that's how you're going to get closer to replacement fertility than in a lowest low 1.3 kind of setting. So gender equity is hypothesized to be the new natalism, and the question we asked is whether the new natalism has replaced religion in terms of, can you actually still have religion fostering fertility when it also fosters traditional gender role attitudes? That's at odds with the idea that women can be workers and mothers together. Not completely at odds, but nonetheless, there's a tension. And we asked the question whether it's becoming less relevant for fertility in a world where the persistence of traditional gender roles is associated with lower fertility. So think Italy, that has a very low fertility. Okay, so this is the first of the graphics from the report that I want to highlight here. And basically, this is just individual level data showing that at the individual level, faith still matters for fertility. Everybody who attends religious services has more kids than those who never or practically never attend. This is data from the 6th wave of the World Values Survey. Also looked over time, and this pattern is more or less the same in all of the last 4 waves of the World Values Survey. This is the oldest one here, with highest attendance rates at the bottom, going to the light blue of lower attendance rates and lower fertility. And if you skip to the top, you see something very similar. In the middle, it's close to the same pattern, although admittedly not exactly. So basically, religiosity has a very similar relationship with childbearing over time. And then we ask the question, why hasn't it become less relevant? And an important answer is sitting right, whoops, I went the wrong way. No, that's right. Is sitting right in front of you in that frequent religious attendance does in fact predicts more traditional gender role attitudes. So the assumption that religious people are more gender traditional is in fact right. The next piece of the assumption is that gender traditionalism is an obstacle to fertility, and that's the piece that's wrong. Individuals with progressive gender role ideology actually have fewer children. Now, this doesn't mean that countries with progressive gender role ideology have fewer children and a lower total fertility rate, but individuals do. And we interrogated that a little bit further to say, okay, what's going on there? Why does this individual level result that says traditional folks have more kids essentially contradict the fact that Sweden has more kids than Italy and Spain? And what's going on with the individual level story versus the country level story? And one explanation is marriage. We used an attitudinal item from the World Values Survey, those who agreed that men should be favored when jobs were scarce. The item was, I think it's, do you think that men should be favored when jobs are scarce? And the people who disagreed are the ones we say have progressive gender role attitudes. And the ones that agree that men should have priority in the job markets when they're tight, or that aren't sure, we put them in the more traditional category. Those who agreed with favoring men when jobs were scarce were 23% more likely to be married than those who disagreed. So that traditional gender role attitude was correlating very heavily with marriage. And not surprisingly, married people averaged more than 3/4 of a child, more than their unmarried peers. So this suggests, but doesn't prove, that religion retains its pronatalist influence by being pro-marriage. I say doesn't prove because people tend to bring their kids to church and get married when they have kids. There can be some reverse causation in there where the presence of children is both sparking religion and sparking marriage. So it doesn't necessarily mean that marriage is the driving force, but it's pretty suggestive. I mean, even if the force is going both directions, 3/4 of a child is a big difference. So we think that the reason why more traditional people have more kids is because they're more likely to be married. What about the US? The US is on the higher end of the fertility fork I showed you at the beginning, despite a dearth of policy supporting combining work and motherhood. I'm sure many people in this room are familiar with how paltry US policy is in terms of federal supports for combining work and motherhood. And one of the explanations is that it has a highly religious population, so that's why it ends up on the higher end, even with policy that doesn't help. But again, fertility's hit a new all-time low. So I'm asking this question again. Has religion become less important for fertility? And this time with a focus on the United States. Religious people in the United States do, in fact, have increasingly distinct fertility in all three of these waves. Why don't I have wave? There's a 2006 wave. Oh, it didn't have children in it. So wave 5 was missing. No, it can't have been children. There was some variable that was missing that I had to leave out wave 5. This isn't selective data. But so wave 3 is at the bottom, 1995 for the US, wave 6 at the top, 2011. And all those places, you see that the never attenders have the lowest fertility, that the infrequent attenders have intermediate fertility, and that the frequent attenders have the highest fertility. What I want you to focus on is the gap. Just because the pattern's the same doesn't mean that the pattern is of the same magnitude. If you look at 2001, and these are children at the time of the survey, so these people who have 1.1 child who are, never go to religious services are going to have more than that lifetime. But, this is cross-sectional at the survey. So they have just over 1 child, where the frequent attenders have in excess of 1.7 children. That is a bigger gap than back in 1995, where it was more like 1.3 versus 1.8. So the gap, fertility is becoming increasingly determined by religion in the US over time, or I should say associated with religion in the US over time. And frequent attenders in the US are in fact more gender traditional, just like in the world, frequent attenders are more gender traditional. But in the US, there are no differentials by gender role ideology. If you remember when I showed this slide for the whole sample, the agree column was statistically significant in terms of if you agreed that men should be favored when, I think my labels might be wrong here, but it almost doesn't matter because there are no important differences. The reason all those 3 bars are the same color is because these differences are statistically insignificant, meaning in the US, we don't see that traditional folks have more children. We do see in the US less attendance over time. Especially if you focus on the green bars, you see a growing proportion of those that never attend religious services. So the retreat from religion is apparent in the US data, at least as measured by attendance. The spiritual but not religious category that Belle mentioned would not be picked up by that particular variable. So back to the question. Gender egalitarianism is supposed to make having children more practical because it saves women from carrying the second shift alone. That's basically the idea about why gender equity should be the new natalism, is that women doing everything doesn't work. That if a woman needs to be a full-time worker and an intensive mother, that she is more likely to opt out than to have 2 kids. That's just too heavy a burden, and there's a sociologist that refers to it as a Lysistrata rebellion. I'm just not taking the traditional gender roles, so I'm not going to get married and have kids at all because the gender bargain is one I do not want, which quite frankly sort of makes sense to me. Even though I love children and I love marriage, the idea of doing it all, I get tired doing a supported second shift. Imagine an unsupported second shift. The second shift is the work you do at home after you have finished your job at work. My husband and I have joked about which shift are we on now? Are we both on our third shift? Anyway, the idea that I've just put forward that gender egalitarianism is the new natalism because the old patterns just simply don't work in women's lives isn't supported in the individual data from the World Values Survey. Traditional folks are still having more children at the individual level. So the summary for what's going on in the US is that there are bigger differences between the most and the least religious over time, but that the share that's highly religious has retreated. Gender equity is not the new natalism, but neither does a higher fertility of the religious support a higher overall fertility. If you think of it in terms of composition, it's like, yeah, religion's becoming more important in terms of its effect, but it's having an effect on a smaller number of people. So neither of those answers seems supported by the US data. The story across other low fertility countries is a little bit different, not hugely different, but nonetheless, I think there's an important contrast. Religion is linked to traditional gender role attitudes across our multi-country sample, just as it was in the US, but it is still pronatalist. Traditional gender role attitudes predict slightly higher fertility, not lower fertility, so that opt-out story isn't an important one in terms of the aggregate picture. And religion is still associated with much higher rates of marriage. And I didn't include this in the presentation, but the influence of marriage is growing over time, too. That the gap in marriage between the least religious and the most religious is growing over time. So the conclusion across the countries that we looked at, all low fertility countries, Europe, in the Americas, East Asia, is that people of faith contribute towards sustainable fertility in modern low fertility societies. Even though I can't say that as strongly for the US, that's still the overall conclusion, that people of faith contribute to sustainable fertility.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Spencer James, and I'm an associate professor at Brigham Young University in the School of Family Life. And I'm going to be presenting to you this morning the second chapter of this report, which we've entitled Faith, Feminism, and Marriage. We're going to talk about institutions, norms, and relationship quality. But I wanted to begin by talking about why we should care about long-term committed relationships. I suspect the fact that you're in this room probably means I don't have to convince you of that. But nonetheless, there are three, among others, really important reasons to worry about this. First is the fact that family change over the last 50 to 70 years has dramatic implications and fuels poverty, insecurity, and inequality. It is not the only thing that fuels those, but it is certainly a key driver of them. And one reason for that is related to number two, which is the fact that committed relationships, most often marriage, are strongly associated with employment patterns, the cessation from criminality, health, and happiness. And finally, a long academic literature shows that children born to and raised by committed, often married parents tend to fare better than children in other various situations. Now, this is, of course, the ideal case. There's plenty of room for wiggle room, and deservedly so, but it is the case that on the population level, marriage and long-term committed relationships like cohabitation very much matter. But of course, it's not just about marital structure, about family structure. The quality of these relationships matter. And as we wrote in the report, to the extent that marriage is able to act as a scaffold for building high-quality relationships, it will remain an important and valued societal institution. But to the degree that it does not, it will decline as a valued societal institution. So the question then becomes, what social institutions do we have, as well as norms, that can help sustain the economic, political, social, etc. conditions where strong and stable relationships can flourish? And the institution that we're focusing on today in this report is religion. Now, despite trends towards secularism that are well established across much of the developed world and beginning to happen in the developing world, it is still the case that a majority of couples in the developed and a very large majority of couples in developing countries worldwide report at least some religious activity. And a sizable minority report pretty high levels of religious devotion. And the reason why this matters is the fact that religion and relationships are linked in a long and enduring academic literature that demonstrates that on average, religious people tend to report higher levels of relationship quality. Certainly there is some selection there, right? There are always selection effects, but there does appear to be a persistent link. But much of this research is focused on the United States. And so we wanted to test whether this link between religion and relationships persists throughout countries in North and South America, Europe, and Australia. Now, related to this, we also wanted to know if this has something to do with the actual effect of religion. Is it about doing religion, or is it merely about being on the same page, in the sense that you may get the exact same benefits if, as a couple, you both are religious or you're both not religious? Is there something about the tension between the two, or is this a true religious effect? To help us answer these questions, we used a new survey that we collected last year. In total, we interviewed 16,474 people across these 11 countries. And again, these countries span North and South America, Europe, and Australia. One quick methodology note is that our sample for the United States is a little bit stronger than for the others, although these are national samples for all of these. Because we focused on couples, we selected out the 9,566 individuals who reported being either married or cohabiting, aged 18 to 50 in heterosexual relationships. And we had about a 2/3, 1/3 split married to cohabiting. Now, when it comes to measuring religiosity, excuse me, we had two pieces of information. The first was how often the respondent attended church. We broke that down by never, at least once a month, and then at least 2 to 3 times per month. And then we also knew whether the respondent's partner, be it a spouse or a cohabiting partner, was more, less, or about the same religiosity as they were. And so we coded this to put people into shared secular couples, less or mixed religious couples, and highly religious couples. So for respondents who never attended church and whose partner was as or less religious than they were put into the shared secular group. In the case of respondents who never attended church but whose partner were more religious, we put these folks in the lesser mixed religious group. For respondents who attended once a month or less, sort of regardless, we put them in the lesser mixed religious group because these are not clearly secular couples, but they're also clearly not both on the highly religious end of the spectrum. And a similar pattern was followed for respondents who attended church at least 2 to 3 times a month. If their partner, was less religious, we put them in the lesser mixed religious category. But for those who attended church 2 to 3 times a month and whose partner was as or perhaps more religious than they were, these were our highly religious couples. In terms of our relationship quality measures, we have 3. I'm only going to talk about 2 today, but I'm certainly happy to talk about that third one. The first is the relationship quality, and this is an index, meaning we are combining 4 distinct questions on relationship quality, namely satisfaction, emotional closeness, commitment, as well as perceived stability. And then we have sexual satisfaction, where we asked how happy or satisfied these people were with their sexual relationship with their partner. And then finally we have joint decision making, which asked whether major household decisions were made jointly between both members of the couple, or whether one or the other makes most major household decisions. So here we have our results. As you can probably tell at this point, there's lots of methodological details that we could get down and dirty in. I'm happy to do that in the Q&A, but for now I'm mostly, to use perhaps a poor metaphor, this is water skiing, not scuba diving. So I'm just going to kind of roll through. So here we have our main results with the Relationship Quality Index. And we have these sorted out by highly religious couples, less or mixed religious couples, and then the shared secular couples. Note that all of these analyses control for a slew of different variables. But what you see first and foremost here is that the highly religious couples report the highest levels of relationship quality, whether it's for the men there in blue or the women in red, compared to their shared secular or less or mixed religious counterparts. And these differences are statistically significant for the highly religious. We see a similar pattern in terms of sexual satisfaction. Here what we're doing is we're predicting the probability that somebody said that they agreed that they're satisfied or very satisfied with the sexual relationship that they have with their partner. Again, we have the highly religious reporting the highest levels when compared to their shared secular or less or mixed religious. Note that in this case, it's actually the highly religious women who are reporting the highest levels, or to be more precise, who have the highest probability of being satisfied. Now, we next sought to nuance this just a little bit because we wondered whether some of this has to do with gender attitudes, that is, gender ideology. And so what we did is we took a question that asked whether they agreed with the statement that it is often better for the man to work outside the home and for the woman to focus more on in-home type of tasks. It's a good, but definitely still heteronormative approach to measuring gender ideology. And what we found was interesting. Particularly among the women, we found what we're calling a J-curve. That is, when you sort out gender traditionalists, who reported that, yes, we think it may be better for this sort of specialization approach, compared to the progressives who said, no, it's not always better, or it's not typically better for women to be working in the home and for the man to work outside of it. When we split it out, we find that a large reason why these shared secular couples reported lower relationship quality in those previous slides was largely because the secular couples who hold gender traditional attitudes report pretty low levels of relationship quality. And in this case, the progressives actually pop up a little bit. Now, this isn't a U-curve in the sense that the shared secular gender progressive couples report similar levels of relationship quality than their religious counterparts. It is still, among the women, the case that the highly religious women, particularly the highly religious gender traditional couples, report the highest levels of relationship quality. But nonetheless, the shared seculars report higher levels than those in the lesser mixed religious groups. I then replicated the same analyses for gender ideology and sexual satisfaction. And here we didn't find that same J-curve. Rather, what we once again found was that the highly religious gender traditional women were the most likely, although most of the other categories were not significantly different from each other. So a little bit messier of a finding there. Next, we sought to examine whether this was the case for the United States specifically, because as we saw, this is an 11-country survey. We wanted to know what was happening in the United States itself. And here, once again, we found that same J-curve among the women, wherein the shared secular gender progressive women reported relatively high levels of relationship quality compared to those in the secular traditional group or in the less or mixed religious group. But once again, with the highly religious reporting the highest levels of relationship quality, especially among the gender traditionalists. So to conclude, what does this mean? Well, first we want to emphasize we cannot address causality. These are cross-sectional data. So we make no claims about causality. We would need to spend a lot more time and, frankly, a few million more dollars before we've got that. But it does appear that religion is consistently linked to better relationships across Europe, North and South America, and Australia. Men and women in highly religious couples enjoy significantly higher levels of relationship quality and sexual satisfaction. Also, women in shared secular progressive relationships enjoy comparatively high levels of relationship quality, while women in the ideological and religious middle report the lowest levels, with highly religious couples, particularly among traditionalist women, reporting the highest levels. So then the question becomes, well, if we're seeing this, what appears to be of a religious bump, the question is why? How might religion foster better relationships? Well, first, we know that religion fosters norms such as marital permanence, fidelity. It also teaches about love, kindness, patience, the importance of forgiveness, that in principle should lead to better relationships and better outcomes. Second of all, it also fosters or creates, or at least allows access to, an entire community of co-believers that can reinforce these norms. Now, of course, that doesn't always work. Social networks don't always have their intended effects, but on average, we would expect this to be the case. Third, we know that religion encourages shared activities and behaviors, that is, rituals, that endow life with a greater sense of meaning, power, and also a connection to something greater than oneself, which a long line of psychological research has shown to be very important for personal well-being as well as for our relationships. The takeaway point then is quite simple. Happy and successful families come in a variety of forms, and religion is one of our key societal institutions, can often help us build better and stronger relationships. Thank you very much.
Okay, Spencer, you switched from my slides to yours very easily, but I'm not going back as fluidly.
Let's see, where are we? Is this the one?
Yeah, that's the one. I have to click forward a bunch, but thank you. Okay. So, oh, I'm sorry. How do I do that? Obviously, I'm not proficient here.
Just click right there.
I can't even find the cursor.
Where did the cursor go?
Don't know.
We have a disappearing cursor. Oh, there we go. No, let's just. Here. I had it a second ago.
Nope.
Okay. I can't figure out how it's.
Try resume slideshow.
No, let's just go. This is obnoxious.
No.
Where did it go? Okay. It's down, but then it disappears. If we had that.
The problem is that this isn't mirroring this
Right.
anymore.
See, it'll come. Okay, here we go.
Yay! Okay. Thank you. So Spencer just talked about positive aspects of relationship quality. It's more depressing to talk about negative relationship behaviors. Intimate partner violence and infidelity are not fun things to talk about. But they're an important thing to consider in the overall picture of how faith, family, and gender ideology interact. So when it comes to religion and negative relationship behaviors, religiously prescribed gender roles could put women at higher risk. This is a very well publicized idea that religious men may feel entitled to dominate their partners, and less likely but still possible is that they may view their position as household head as license to cheat. So basically, if you have a doctrine that says that the man's the head of the household, it could have some very negative outcomes associated with it. I am the lead author on this chapter, but I didn't write this sentence, so I'm allowed to say that it's one of my favorite sentences in the whole chapter since I didn't write it. By proof texting, that is, selectively using scripture from, quote, patriarchal passages of their scriptures, religions can provide frames that lead men to see intimate partner violence as divinely sanctioned expression of their patriarchal authority, and women to accept abusive relationships as divinely ordained trials to be endured, rather than problematic situations from which to flee. It's terrible, but we're asking, how true is it? Because we want to know how true it is. There's also the possibility that religion is what we call a double-edged sword, that even if it is as bad as that last slide indicates it could be, that's going to be offset by norms, networks, and nomos of religious communities that encourage positive family functioning. What are those? They're messages and understanding about the importance of good marriages and families, instruction in how to achieve good marriages and stable families, emotional support and accountability. I think that I don't want to gloss over that one too fast. There's a difference between knowing what's right and having someone who knows you know whether you're doing it or not. That embeddedness in community creates accountability. If your prayer partner knows you're beating your wife, there's going to be a lot of pressure on you to change that behavior. And also, marriages can be imbued with spiritual character and significance. There's a psychologist that refers to this as the sanctification of marriage. And again, I don't want to brush over it, because if your family is viewed as part of who you are as a person of faith, it has a different significance than it's just part of who you are as an individual. So all of these positive possibilities can matter more for religious couples than for religious individuals. I assume the logic behind that is fairly transparent, that if you're both embedded in a community that provides accountability, that if you both share the same norms, that whatever positive influences come from norms, networks, and nomos, that they're more enforcing of relationship quality if they are shared. So this brings us to our analytic approach, which is exactly the same as you saw in the last chapter, so I don't have to explain it as thoroughly. We use couple religiosity. So it's not, are you as a man of faith more likely to beat your partner, but are you as someone in a highly religious relationship more likely to beat your partner than someone in a shared secular relationship or in one of those less mixed religious relationships? So we're comparing men and women according to couple spirituality. And we specifically test whether belief in male headship matters. And again, a piece of the chapter 3 that I didn't write that makes it into the slides because I liked it so much. Beliefs are often inferred with, we suspect, a healthy dose of measurement error from measures of religious affiliation. Translated, we assume that if you go to a conservative Presbyterian church that doesn't allow women in the pulpit, you must be one of those patriarchal folks. Or a Catholic church where women aren't allowed in the priesthood, or fill in your example. The idea is that your affiliation predicts your doctrine with respect to whether the man is the head of the household or not. But we suspected a healthy dose of measurement error on that. So for the Global Family, Faith, and Gender Survey, what we did was actually ask people, do you believe that the man is head of the household? So first, I'm going to show you results without our headship variable, so just across those 3 categories of couple religiosity, and then I'm going to show you results with the headship variable. So for victimization, I don't even have a graphic because there are no differences among couple types. I could have showed that, but I tried to keep it short and sweet. For perpetration, okay, so victimization is women. Are women in each of those 3 couple types distinctly different with respect to their chance of being a victim of intimate partner violence? And the answer is no. And with respect to perpetration, the question is are men in each of those 3 religious couple types more likely to perpetrate intimate partner violence? And again, the answer is no. So completely statistically insignificant there. When it comes to infidelity, and I will actually show you this, but I'll give you the summary before the graph, the infidelity in both shared and secular religious couples, that between those 2 ends of the spectrum, that it doesn't differ, but that there's more cheating in the middle group. And this is what it looks like. That especially for men, those that are in less or mixed religious relationships. And by the way, most of those are less. 87% of our less and mixed were less, where both partners attend religious services somewhere between once a year and once a month. And only 13% of them are mixed, where one partner has a distinct pattern of attendance from the other. So most of those have the advantage of being on the same page. And we did actually test whether those two were different, and they weren't, which is why we left them rolled together. But in that middle group, the less and mixed religious relationships, the predicted probability of men cheating was 0.18. So men were more likely to cheat, and you see that the shared secular men cheated at half that rate. 0.09 was the predicted probability. So there's a distinct advantage to having a shared secular shared ethos compared to a middling shared ethos. There's also a distinct advantage to being highly religious. And for the men, there's no difference between the shared secular estimate and the highly religious estimate, but you can see that the point estimate is actually a little bit favors the shared secular men. Don't make anything of that tiny difference, but they're both advantaged. For the women, the shared secular women don't cheat at lower rates than the women in the middle. That 0.11 and 0.10 are not statistically different, but the highly religious women actually do cheat on their partners at a lower level than ones in the middle, but not at a lower level than the shared seculars. So the big contrast that I'm drawing here is with the middle rather than between the ends. Okay. So this is where it gets interesting for me. Not that that wasn't interesting, but what about this idea that the doctrine of male headship is the real problem? Let's find out whether it is. So looking at these same three outcomes, first, victimization. Shared secular women who do not view men as household heads are less likely to be victims. That's the only difference. Other than that, we see exactly the same thing. And this is what it looks like. That, well, not exactly the same thing, because you don't see, well, yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, the same thing, because most of these differences are still statistically insignificant. I didn't show you a graph for victimization before because it was boring. I said all three bars are the same height. I'm not even going to show it to you. Now I'm showing you all 6 bars. They're almost all the same height. The one difference is between the folks in the middle that hold patriarchal attitudes. Yes, the man is the household head. And the folks in shared secular couples that hold egalitarian attitudes. No, the man is not the household head, or I don't agree with the statement that he is. What I think comes out there is that headship does matter, but minimally. It's if you aren't in a religious relationship, your belief can have an influence on the probability of being a victim of intimate partner violence. But it's a little bit surprising that that was the only significant result. Moving on to perpetration. Again, you don't get to see it because it's too boring. Same across all 6 categories. Before it was the same across all 3 categories. Without headship, we add headship, it's still the same. Finally, infidelity. There are lower rates of cheating among men in shared secular relationships. You saw that before, but those pertain only among the egalitarians. So headship does matter a little bit. I'll read this last part and then show it to you because it's easier to look at the graphic. And the lower rates of cheating among men and women in highly religious couples become statistically insignificant. So this is what it looks like. You no longer have less cheating among the highly religious when you separate the egalitarians from the patriarchals. I think some of that is just simply sample size because there's still an advantage and they're not that different from each other. I mean, 0.11 and 0.12 and 0.06 and 0.06, those categories aren't very different from each other. On the highly religious end of the spectrum, the gender role ideology doesn't matter that much. Nonetheless, adding the gender role ideology makes the cheating advantage among the highly religious go away. For men, the shared secular men have an advantage over the men in the middle if and only if they are egalitarian. So it's the secular men that do not view themselves as the household heads who have a lower rate of cheating than the folks in the middle. So those that believe more in gender equality in shared secular relationships have an advantage over either the egalitarians or the patriarchal folks in the middle. Okay, so the summary is that the belief in male headship, and these are my words, this isn't in the chapter, is overrated as a risk factor. that when we actually measure that instead of inferring it, we don't see a lot of evidence. It does differentiate shared secular couples, importantly. I thought this was worth noting, is that it didn't differentiate religious couples, but it did differentiate shared secular couples. So if you're in a religious couple, whether you believe the man's the head of the household or not doesn't matter all that much, or doesn't matter at all, for intimate partner violence perpetration, victimization, or fidelity for men or women. If you are in a shared secular relationship, the advantages associated with that over the folks in the middle are only among the egalitarians. And this should remind you of the J-curve, where you saw that advantage among the shared secular egalitarians, but not so much among the secular traditionalists. So I think this is very consistent with the J-curve. Overall, highly religious couples, shared secular couples, and those in between are all similar in terms of the violence occurring within their intimate partnerships. With respect to the rhetoric that says that religious folks are more at risk, especially because of the doctrine of headship, religious couples experience and commit intimate partner violence just as non-religious couples do. And religious participation in itself does not safeguard against intimate partner violence the way that nomos, norms, networks, rhetoric would say it should safeguard against intimate partner violence. But the other important conclusion is that less and mixed religious couples experience more infidelity than folks at the extremes. So the way that we interpret this, I mean, we basically, the question that pops out to me with this set of findings is, why doesn't religiosity protect against these negative relationship outcomes, especially given that you just heard that it promotes relationship quality? If it promotes relationship quality, shouldn't it be associated with less beating and less cheating? And we have two answers to that question. One is that religion is falling short of its potential as a protective factor. There's very little pastoral training in how to deal with intimate partner violence within congregations. Nancy Nason Clark has a network of folks that have researched this, and her stats on the classes that you get in seminary on intimate partner violence are almost zero in almost all traditions in Canada and the United States. Now, granted, our data covers more than that, but I really don't suspect that Mexican seminaries are a heck of a lot better. So one is that the pastors aren't being trained on how to deal with this very important problem that afflicts religious communities just as it afflicts other communities, and also that there's suffering in silence, that there's some shame in going to your pastor, your potentially ill-equipped pastor, and saying, I need help because my husband's beating me. So the combination of individual level behavior and institutional level behavior can be preventing religion from meeting its potential as a protective factor. And so that's part of our explanation. But finally, shared secular, egalitarian, and highly religious couples have important similarities. Now, the word I have up on the slides is homogamy. I actually like Spencer's much better, same page. That being on the same page has its own good effect. I'm discounting that somewhat, though, because a lot of those people in the middle were on the same page. Again, 87% of them. So I'm emphasizing the mutual respect part of it. That in a shared secular egalitarian relationship, as in highly religious relationships, regardless of headship doctrine, there's a lot of shared mutual respect for the other person, as a creation of God, that partner has dignity. And I'm not saying that that's completely absent in the other categories, just that it's less reinforced in the other categories, and that may be a very important reason why they're different in relationship quality. Okay, so very briefly, is the overall story the same in the US? Victimization, yes. No differences by religious couple type. Perpetration, yes. No differences by religious couple type. Infidelity. Women in the US who are highly religious cheat on their partners less than either those in the middle or shared secular women. No differences for men. So the story is a little different for the US because there is a religious advantage, but for the intimate partner violent outcomes, no difference between the US and overall.
Good morning. I'm Conrad Hackett, Senior Demographer at Pew Research Center, and it's my pleasure this morning to engage with this very interesting report, although I'm going to engage in a narrow part of the richness that's here. The very last thing Lori said in her first presentation is that people of faith can support sustainable fertility levels. And this gets back to some ideas in the first chapter that were fascinating to me, and I want to discuss two questions based on them, and then comment on one of the conclusions from the Religion and Fertility chapter. So my first question is, should replacement level fertility be a goal for society? The fertility chapter takes the normative position that replacement level fertility of 2.1 children per woman on average should indeed be society's goal. The authors describe this with their term sustainable fertility. And I would have liked to know more about this and why they see this as the particular goal that society should strive for. Some people make an economic argument that in fact higher fertility is desirable because it could drive economic growth, while others would argue that fertility levels below replacement level fertility are desirable because they will minimize the human impact on our planet. But what is the rationale for replacement level fertility, and why do we call this sustainable? My second question is, if we grant that low fertility that exists in many advanced countries currently is a problem, is religion the answer? According to this the analysis you saw here, fertility levels have been declining over a 20-year period across people of all religious commitment levels, although at any point in time, the more frequently a person attends religious services, the more children they have on average. I'd like to highlight three implications of this pattern. Implication number one, in many advanced economies, even fairly religious young adults may already be on track when they finish their childbearing years to have below replacement fertility. And furthermore, if the highly religious continue to follow the trend of their less religious forebears, then this trajectory of declining fertility over time that the report shows suggests the fertility of the faithful will merely slow down the move below replacement level fertility that is underway rather than having the potential to reverse course. Implication number two, an interesting consequence of these fertility differences, if everyone is having declining fertility but the more religious are having more kids, that means that if everything else were equal over the long term, and if children inherit their parents' religion, then the society would become more religious through fertility. Now, in countries like the United States, we know that something else is going on. People tend to move away from their parents' religion as they age. But however, globally, projections my team at Pew Research Center has done suggest that in the broader world, where we have highly religious countries without the kind of secularization we see in the West, if current patterns continue, then we could have very large fertility differences between the secularizing West and the rapidly growing rest of the world, driving a more religious world overall, even if there's different dynamics in Western countries. Implication number three, if the fertility of the faithful is not the solution for challenges related to low fertility, like the economic burden of supporting aging societies, then it could be that alternate solutions are more feasible. such as welcoming immigrants from countries that still have very high fertility rates. Now, finally, I'd like to turn to the conclusion of this paper, which claims that, quote, across low fertility countries in the Americas, Europe, East Asia, and Oceania, the fertility gap associated with extremes of religiosity increased 15% from 0.24 children to 0.27 children across the last 2 decades. The report contrasts the average number of children ever born to respondents currently aged 15 to 49 who attend worship services more than once a week versus those who never attend in various waves of the World Values Survey. And the highlighted conclusion suggests that the impact of religion has grown between wave 3 and wave 6 of the report, of the survey rather. Now at one point, the authors do acknowledge that this difference is, quote, too small to matter statistically. And I'm inclined to agree, but since the authors nonetheless give prominence to this difference in the conclusion and introduction, I think it's worth considering that if they had instead compared the results from different waves shown in the report, their method of comparison could have led to a different conclusion, that the impact of religion, while persistent, is waning. For example, if they compared the data they report for wave 4 with wave 6, then we would see a shrinking of the gap by 22% from 0.35 children to 0.27 children. I would contend that, in fact, this data is not really adequate to evaluate whether the gap is growing or shrinking. In conclusion, I want to affirm that after the educational attainment of women, religion remains one of the most important factors affecting childbearing. But I think we need a little bit more evidence before we can conclude whether the influence of religion is increasing or decreasing. Going back to the question of whether society should aim for replacement level fertility, I'm not going to take a position on that, but I would love to know what panelists think and what you all think. And to the question of whether, if low fertility is a problem, can religion be the solution? I must confess that I'm not sure how the fertility of the faithful can be adequate to bring low fertility countries back up to replacement level fertility.
Hi, I'm Christine Emba. I'm a columnist at the Washington Post, and I'm going to provide a generational perspective. And since we've had a lot of discussion on the results of the study already, I will try to keep it brief. So I'll admit, first off, that I am a millennial, a part of that much maligned generation. And when we're not busy eating avocado toast and killing paper napkins, diamonds, the restaurant Hooters, we're putting off our relationships, and we're wondering how we could ever afford, or even if we want, children. And yet, we're up. It's our time. My generation is at the end of their 20s and in their 30s. We're in the primary position to be buying houses, marrying, yes, having children, and setting up our adult futures. But we, and women especially I speak of here, worry not just about cost, but about fairness and the toll that relationships and fertility, as we've been calling it, may have on our lives. Will marriage be fair? Who wins and who loses in careers, in leisure time, and in health? And are we sure that we can count on our partners to be real partners? And of course, a side question, do we even have partners? Tinder is not helping us all that much here. Relationships based on or colored by religion, another one of those institutions and norms that we are bent on destroying as a generation, are often viewed with a particular skepticism. We're paranoid, you see. We may have watched our parents break up. We may have watched the economy crumble. And we may have seen many of the same traumas in religion and religious institutions, as I think everyone in this room can understand. Yet when we talk about the relationship between, well, relationships and religion, one of the biggest concerns is equity. which is why, in this study, The Ties That Bind, the distinction between patriarchal and egalitarian couples was so interesting. That said, The Ties That Bind had some counterintuitive takes, at least from my perspective. The first, which we've gone over, and so I'll water ski past it, as Spencer said, was about J-curves. There were a number of different J-curves in this study, and mainly they showed that being unequally yoked, as it was called in my evangelical Wednesday night classes, or marrying a partner of another faith or belief sect is less than ideal. And this became particularly apparent in discussions of relationship quality. So couples who were the same, aligned in secularism and in their gender ideology, usually progressive, as well as couples who were aligned on the other end, religious and traditional or patriarchal, were the happiest. They won on measures of satisfaction, attachment, commitment, and stability. Of course, for relationship quality, income was the best predictor, but I think we could all expect that. The most intriguing point I found, though, in this study was this line, and I'll actually just read it from the study. Religion may channel gender traditionalism into a family-centered form of living that gives partners clear norms for their relationship and family life, but does so in ways that are interpreted as solidarity-enhancing rather than patriarchal. By contrast, gender traditionalism in more secular or only nominally religious contexts may give men a license to treat their partners in more domineering and less considerate ways. The latter, I think, is what most progressives and progressive millennials fear when it comes to relationships, religion, and both of those combined. However, many of us seem not as clear. We seem not to know that the former may be possible. As the data continues to appear, and as we discuss on this panel, I'm interested in seeing whether our opinions begin to change.
We are a little bit behind on time, but let's take a few questions from the audience. Please state who you are and where you're from. Right here. Do we have, I think we have a microphone coming. Yes, we do.
Thank you very much. Larry Checco, Senior Advisor to Serve USA. Just a little personal background. I've been married to my wife for 40 years. It's been a great monogamous relationship. I would classify us as SBNRs, I think it is, okay? But I think you could almost exchange the word religion for economic inequality as well. I think a lot of healthy marriages depend on good incomes. And I think a lot of what's going on today in terms of family breakup is financial stress. And I don't think this report covered that at all. And I think that, well, anyway, that's my question would be, should you have included economics and income into your report? Because I think it would sway things a lot.
I think that's a great question, and before you all answer, I'm going to collect a couple of questions given our time limitations. There were a lot of hands in the back on the aisle there.
Yeah, Gabriel Greenspan from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So I thought it was interesting examining the idea of mixed couples.
Put the mic closer.
Okay. I thought it was very interesting examining mixed couples. Couples where one of the people is religious and one of the couples is not religious. I was wondering, did you look at couples where both partners are religious but they're from different faith traditions? One is a devout Christian and one is a devout Jew, for instance, or one is a devout Jew and one is a devout Muslim. You know, you can pick your examples, but what is the effect there if you have two highly religious people from different faith traditions?
Good. The woman right behind, yes.
My name is Anne Solkovsky, and I used to live and work in the countries of Niger, Senegal, and Tunisia. So this is a question I'd like to hear more about Muslim sub-Saharan Africa. I've heard about many other continents.
One more question here.
Actually, I have 3 quick questions.
Okay.
They're quick. I'm Beverly Sauer. I was formerly tenured at Carnegie Mellon, but I'm now retired and a choir girl. So there's the data question. You don't really discriminate about 1 child versus 6 in highly religious relationships and how that might skew your data on the number of children. Another one might be, is it the network effect of religion, or are there other networks which might serve the same purpose in a secular couple? And then are there safeguards in religion that enable people to get out in ways that maybe there aren't safeguards where you don't have a network or somebody looking after you?
Okay, thank you. These are great questions. I'm going to turn now to the panel, and I don't think all of you should answer every question, so try to trade off. The first one is about economics. Who wants to take the economics one?
Yeah. Can you hear me? I'm not.
Yeah, you're mic'd, I think, yes.
I'm always debating because I teach large classes, so I can project if necessary. So the answer is we did take a good, long, hard look at the economics. I didn't have time to sort of draw up the graphs, although they are available in the report. And what we found is that what we're calling this religious association is similar in size to our finances variable. Of course, when you're doing a cross-country study, you can't just ask straight up about income, because income means different things across contexts. And so we have a variable that asks roughly how comfortable your finances are. Very comfortable, not at all, etc. And when we compared the relative effects of that finance variable to these religious variables, they produced similar effect sizes. Now, I'm 100% with you. If I could change one thing in an instant, I would change people's economic outlooks. I think that's ultimately where the money's at. But that doesn't negate the fact that religion still has this clear and persistent link across countries. So
Do you want to get in on this?
we did, I guess.
Christine wants to get in on this one, too.
Yeah, it's where the money's at. So I would hypothesize, and I wonder if you guys can tell me if this seems correct, that religion in relationships that are perhaps financially troubled or less financially secure might still be helpful in keeping parents together because of what you described as nomos and networks. So the idea that there is, a faith or a higher cause or a reason that this relationship exists and that one should protect it, even though there are outside forces, financial forces, putting pressure on it. And also the idea that there could be social networks that would help a financially unstable or troubled family stay intact, whether through church networks, networks of religion online, networks elsewhere, where people can reach out for either material or sort of psychological and philosophical assistance. That is what I've seen in my limited experience. Families with children who are undergoing financial instability, reaching out to their churches and asking for donations, or seeing if someone can take care of their kids, or talk to their husband or wife about what to do, or help them find a job, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that religion can actually have an impact on the economic question. But then I would say, again, with this generational perspective, absolutely yes. And this was one of the questions that I too had about the report. I was not a contributor to the report. I'm just commenting on it. I think it's very clear, and the research has long shown, that financial hardship is one of the #1 causes of relationship breakup and family breakup and instability. And also, when we're speaking of fertility, especially in my generation and younger generations overall, when you ask why people are not getting married or having children or having as many children as they would like, the number 1, 2, and 3 responses in most surveys tend to be about financial hardship of some kind. Either we can't afford a wedding, or we can't afford childcare, or we can't afford to have simply another child, even though we would want one. And so I do think that this economic inequality and economic instability is probably the #1 question that we have.
but there are many other studies, I think, that do focus on that.
So the question about different faith backgrounds, do you want to take that, Lori, or somebody?
Do you want to? I would be guessing. You've looked at the data more closely.
So we looked at that early on, but we haven't yet had a chance to dig precisely into that different faith couple combination. We did control for different religious affiliations and didn't find a lot of differences, but of course those differences are only across the outcomes rather than looking at differences across the couples. But that's a really interesting question, one that we plan to explore in the upcoming months.
And we'll probably run into sample size problems.
Yeah, I mean, we'll be limited to the larger affiliations, of course. I mean, there's not that many Buddhists, for example, in our study. But.
If I can interject for a moment here, I think this first question about what are the big drivers, you know, you all wanted to focus on the role of religion and gender ideology, and that's really interesting. But I kept thinking you've got this massive data set, you've got 11 countries, you've got 11 identified religious affiliations, and you did break out the US for some of your analyses. But I kept thinking, what are the big drivers here? Did you ever run an analysis that simply looked for what is the, you know, what are the right-hand variables when you put them all in there that have the biggest effects? Is it economics? Is it something else? Is it what Christine is talking about? Is it education of women, which I would be high on my list, and I think Conrad mentioned.
Well, the answer is yes.
Yeah, okay.
And the three biggest, in no particular order, were education, particularly among women, as you just mentioned, finances. Again, we can't get exactly at income because, you know.
Right.
Yeah. And then third was religion. In terms of the three variables that seemed to separate out along the relationship quality, sexual satisfaction, joint decision-making variables. Those were sort of the three largest differentiators.
Okay. Somebody asked about Muslim countries, I think, and then we had a lot of questions at the end about is there a big distribution of, you know, kids with the highly religious and especially the more traditional couples having lots of kids, maybe affecting the analysis? Any comments about those last couple of questions?
I'll take those.
Okay.
We would love to expand the Global Family and Gender Survey to more lower-income countries, because the Latin American countries that we included were relatively high-income countries. We don't have Bolivia.
And for the record, I pushed to include Africa here, but I got shot down.
Spencer and I both have an affinity for Africa, as you do. We had a South African potential partner that didn't work out, and we were bummed. Not that South Africa is Nigeria. It'd be interesting to...
Niger.
Well, Niger, Nigeria, and Senegal, didn't you mention?
Niger, Senegal, Tunisia.
Okay, sorry. And then, right, but on the Muslim end, to look at Northern Africa as well, or countries in the Middle East. So we would like to have a second round of our survey specifically to pick up lower income countries and Muslim countries. It's not that there are no other countries we could pick up if we were successful in getting funding for a second round, but those are our two big priorities, is what does this look like in lower income countries, and what does this look like in Muslim countries? And then I'll answer, I did do average fertility. I'll defend that just by saying that if we're looking at it at a societal level, that's the right measure. I understand that the distributions get skewed by people that have 5 or 6 children, or 7 or 8. But in terms of the aggregate question, I think that the combined measure is the right one.
Okay, I think, go ahead.
Sorry, on the Africa point and Muslims, I just wanted to say that our work at Pew has found, as this report found, that Muslim fertility tends to be higher than for any other group. That's a general pattern that's true in many countries. And in Africa, the high fertility for both Christians and Muslims is profoundly consequential for the future trajectory of the world. And Christians are increasingly more concentrated in Africa because of high fertility, and the high Muslim fertility in Africa and elsewhere is making the world increasingly Muslim.
I'm going to make an executive decision that because this was such an interesting panel, and it really was, and you all did a great job, but we did go over our time. So I'm going to suggest if you need a break, just take it informally. And we are going to pull up the second panel up right now as soon as we thank this panel. So join me in thanking this one.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.